Extreme market volatility, supply chain chaos, and continuous disruption means that accurate forecasting and planning is absolutely critical at this point, and possibly also the hardest job in the industry right now. So to continue our commitment to bring you the very best of analysis and insights on the industry, and bringing along his crystal ball with him, I'm delighted that we have Henner Lehne, Vice President of Global Forecasting at S&P Global Mobility, joining us today. Henner is responsible for the global vehicle sales and production forecast of the group. Many of you have been relying on his services and his know-how for many a year. I think you joined what was CSM worldwide back in 2005, working through the various iterations, most recently IHS Markit, and now, of course, S&P Global. So delighted to have you here, and here to educate our audience and to look into that crystal ball. I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me. And I have to admit, first conference live on stage since January 2020. So this is a premiere. We're starting up again in these difficult times. Everything virtual, so I'm really, really happy to see so many people in the room, and really looking forward to the exchange afterwards, right? Real people, real conversations, not just teams staring to a monitor. So the conference theme, and as I just said it to Richard, is quite interesting. We should have come up ourselves with it, forecasting the never normal. It's really, from a forecasting analytical side, exciting times. If you have to do business in these environments, of course, maybe not so exciting, more sleepless nights. But I want to walk you through a little bit what's going on, what are the impacts on demand, on production, a little bit on the topic of electrification. Then hopefully afterwards we have a couple minutes to discuss a couple additional questions you might have, or Richard might have for me. Before that, I need to do some quick advertisement in own matters. Most of you know us as IHS Markit. So those who know us, IHS Markit, as of March, we're no longer IHS Markit. So the merger, which was pending for 15 months, now completed. So we're now filing under S&P Global, Standard & Poor's, and we're one of 6 divisions at S&P, and we're now running under S&P Global Mobility. So if you see in the future S&P Global Mobility, it's still your trusted forecast partners from IHS Markit, just new branding, new logo, but in the end, content team-wise, nothing changes. So forecasting the never normal. For that, actually, I took a look at our forecast all the way back to 2011. 2011, we had a first merger, and Richard said it. Originally, I came from a small Detroit outlet, got acquired in 2010 by IHS. And then 2011, we formed what was called IHS Automotive. So where the story, really, the growth path began, the combined businesses of Global Insight and CSM. And I looked at the forecast we did, and actually, we weren't doing such a bad job. All the way to 2017, our forecast accuracy in the short term, 1 to 2 years, given all the things going on, in 1%, 2% actually deviation. And if you think about it, what happened, right? There was the Brexit. I know a lot of Englishmen in the room, right? There was the Iran conflict. There was earthquakes, recovery profile from Lehman Brothers. But in the short term, we actually, and you can see it with the lines, we didn't do too bad until 2018. When China started taking a dive because of legislation changes, and then, of course, came COVID in 2020. And as you can see from the forecast curves, it moves quite volatile. And the question is, how will the future look like? Forecasting the never normal maybe is the normal. You have a here and now projection. You need to work with bandwidth, with scenarios, but pinpointing a number 5, 6 years out, and I know a lot of you in logistics, because many of you are our customers, you need to plan 5, 6, 7 years ahead. If you order a new chip or increase your fleet, the plane fleet, this is nothing you just buy tomorrow, right? You need to have long-term planning. So I think the only chance which we have in these environments is planning in a scenario bandwidth, because you can see the fluctuations and the unforeseeable, and the impacts are coming closer and closer. And who would have thought? Good recovery from COVID, then came the chip crisis. Chip crisis kind of under control, still restrictions, and then came the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and who knows what's next. Nevertheless, quick look at the global economics. We have two different paths there. One is the mature markets, which threw a lot of money during COVID at the recovery. You can see they came off all quite a high peak, US, UK, Eurozone, India, China also. But for the mature markets, you will see we're going down and we're going to continue to go down. Pretty much the ammunition is fired. And of course, the dependence on what's going on with the Ukraine crisis and the energy crisis related to it is quite imminent. On the other hand, the emerging markets, Brazil, Mexico, China, TBD, and we will talk a little bit about China throughout the presentation, will normally enjoy more growth going forward versus the mature markets are just coming down off higher levels. We as IHS Markit or S&P Global, we have the so-called IHS Manufacturing PMI, the Purchasing Manager Index, something you might see in the newspapers. We're the ones who are actually tracking that, surveying purchasing managers in all kinds of areas all over the world, asking for their sentiment. And as you can see, and how to read the chart, above 50 means market expansion in the end, below 50, contraction. And you can see China already since 2021, into 2021, very low at the 50 mark, so not much going on, very strict COVID policy, very controlled business, whereas you can see United States, Eurozone spiked, full recovery, full on after COVID with all the money pumped into the market, and then its second half, chip crisis really hit, and you saw a decline again. Japan, slightly different path, but not too much extraction. The interesting thing is we can see, especially in the US and in Japan, it's actually pointing up a little bit, the latest survey. And that could signal, of course, it's always speculation at the end what it is, but could signal that there's a little bit less stress in these supply chains, in operations, what these purchasing managers are facing these days. One of the big problems of concern is the material prices. And materials sourcing is the topic besides the chip question, energy cost. And you can see the material price index is at an all-time high now. New record, and if you look at the dependency, which now became very obvious on Russia, on Ukraine, on raw materials, but also on energy, is driving prices up. And actually this chart is already outdated. We're already above the 5. We're at 5.5 now, indexed-wise, for material price index. And where we're coming close to the peak. Nevertheless, our colleagues from the pricing researching team think that toward the end of Q2, we will have reached the peak, and then it will come down again, because there's an irony in it. There is a lot of restriction, of course, in the availability of certain materials. Nevertheless, there's also, because Russia is now taken out of the game, less demand. So there will be a de-stress coming, and a correction forecasted at the end of Q2 into H2 of this year. It's not going to come down significantly, but the peak is set to come short before summer. When we're looking at demand, and we call it sales, but we should probably name it demand, we also have two different patterns. We see North America up, Middle East, Africa up, South Asia up, mainland China still up in the year-over-year comparison, what we're thinking for this year, what the forecast will do. Mainland China, as said, we're going to talk a little bit about it. It's a little bit of a wild card because we saw what's happening with the lockdown in Shanghai, the lockdown which is now coming in Beijing, which seems to be tightening more and more. And the question, how long will it take? I heard Guangzhou is also now on the list. So we have to see how strict those will be executed and what then in the end, economic damage will look like, and therefore then also if this forecast number is holdable. But this is something you cannot put in your base case, so we can only forecast from the here and now with a short-term assumption. We think China should be out of the worst by summer, but let's see. And then it would still be 2.1% growth. Europe, on the other hand, and we're going to look at the numbers a little bit more in detail later, West Europe is up. It's enjoying recovery growth. But of course, we had to take Russia and Ukraine completely out of the forecast, more or less, which you can see result in an overall Europe downgrade of around about 700,000 units. So now I'm trying to do an experiment with you, and I know it's hard to read from the back, so stay with me. We're getting a lot of questions, why is the forecast actually, because we have such a devastating situation with Russia and Ukraine, why is the forecast not much lower? What's happening? And I will try to show you a decomposition of the rationale on how the forecast actually is developing and why the numbers look the way they look. So, if we're looking, this is our April forecast, green is production, red is sales. You can see, actually, we had in 2020, 2021, sales was higher than production, so pretty much demand lift of inventories. And if you go into the markets, which are very inventory heavy, for example, the United States, good luck trying to buy a car directly from the dealer. You're not going to get it because inventory is gone. Pretty much everywhere in the store it's gone. It's super tight. Going forward, you will see only slight inventory build-up, because one thing the industry actually learned, inventory is something we don't need. We can do more on-demand sales and don't have to have giant stocks, US up in peak 3.5 million units inventory standing around. We believe this is not coming back, and so the destocking will take a little bit of time. You can also see that demand pretty much is flat this year, so we're around about at the 80 million. 80 million 4 is demand, 80 million 6 is production. And then we have a recovery curve all the way to 97 million. So that's the current forecast. So how is the Ukraine-Russia crisis impacted there? In order to look at that, we have to see how did we downgrade the forecast for the Ukraine crisis. So the dotted line here is what the forecast was still in January, when everybody was still hoping it's not going to escalate. And there we actually were 2 million units higher. We were at 82 million roundabout this year, and even the longer term, the recovery profile was much sharper, going past the 100 million mark by 2028. So if we look at that, why actually is only 2 million units taken out here? Because the war, the crisis is now today, and actually there's a bigger gap longer term. And the reason is that, and if we have to look at that, if the clicker works, is that there is significant overdemand and not enough production. For the first time in a couple of years, so actually in 2021 we saw it, are we a supply-driven market, not a demand-driven market? Normally, demand dictates what supply will look like, but it's the other way around. Everything that gets built will be sold, and there's so much more demand than actually what can be built, and this is primarily due to the semiconductor crisis, so some other incidents. Also, we had now, of course, the Ukraine-Russia impact on wiring harness. This was a big topic, right? European wiring harness manufacturing at the border of Ukraine. Even the operations are running. How do you get it in? How do you get it out, right? Logistics questions. So that is why, in the short term, actually, that overdemand, we are not taking much more volume out. And if you look at the gray line here, the gray line is what we call it is a benchmark. The benchmark last July. Just to July, we took as a benchmark because everybody thought, hey, semiconductor crisis will be over. Everybody told us they're going to work through the summer break and the situation's resolved. We all know that didn't happen, and from then it really went downhill. So this is our benchmark forecast, and you can see that we have this supply constraint. So this was the demand, this was the theoretical supply, and in overall, if you look at it and look at the difference between these two, we're talking 12.5 million vehicles over demand that could not be fulfilled. So 12.5 million people last year, this year, next year, sitting there waiting for a car they can't get. And if you want to get a car these days, depending on what it is, you might be one of those because it's really not much available. There are brands, and I'm not going to name them, they're advertising that they're not the most attractive car, but you can have it in 6 weeks. It's a new selling argument, availability. So this is pretty much how it looked before the crisis. So in order now to see what the Ukraine impact is, we had to look at the destruction of demand. So we had to take demand out. This is a dotted green line. So the potential demand, taking it down, and this is mainly taking out, of course, the Russian market. Russian market runs at around about 1.6 million units. We pretty much took 900,000 out, Ukraine pretty much zero. And then, of course, the demand disruption for uncertainty, increased in prices, inflation, and so on. Now the increase, of course, was the central banks, at least the US central bank is already doing it. European Central Bank might consider doing it. Increase of interest rates with then financing credit and all these leasing programs, will it make more expensive? So the times of cheap money will end as well. So this is how we look at the destruction of demand. And then you can see how it relates to the forecast we have. What's also interesting, here you can see 12.5 million units taken out, but only 6 million units will be recovered. So half of the demand, over demand, will be lost anyways. You have certain patience, but more than 12, 18 months waiting for a car is not going to happen. So either you go used, if you get it used, this is also a lot under pressure, or you're just going to keep your car and not bother about it. So we believe around about half of the demand, constrained demand, will not come back. With that new situation, it's actually even more. So the loss of the industry is quite significant. First of all, the overdemand is reduced, but also we're only believing that around about 3.5 million units can be recovered still from an overdemand point of view, and the rest is lost because of the current situation, which is impacting not only the people living in Europe, but in the US and everywhere because of the factors of inflation, crisis of energy costs, availability, and of course uncertainty. There's a lot of fear in the market which cannot be underestimated as well. This is another view on how the impact looks like. Interestingly enough, we actually had at the beginning of the year an improved chip availability. Some inventories over chip over the downtimes in Q4 were discovered. Of course, also Russia is not going to take many chips these days anymore. So there is a little bit of upside on the chip side being found, but lots of downside, right? You see the gray line. Pretty much we took the Russian forecast down to a minimum existence level. We're running at flat at around about 900,000, and this is even debatable if this will be possible in the long run. And Ukraine forecast, of course, everywhere can imagine not much is going to be sold there either in the next time. Then, of course, the supply chain disruptions, I mentioned it, primarily the semiconductor, and then the overall demand destruction from all the economic factors, which will actually not make you buy a new vehicle going forward. And price and costing is, of course, one of the major drivers there. So there's the demand side. Quickly, West Europe, Central West Europe, as said, actually not too bad despite the ongoing struggles in the neighborhood. But 1.6% growth, 14 million reached, but way below the potential. If you look at 2019, it was 18 million. So we're still running 4 million below what the normal used to be in the past. Since this is a logistics conference, I looked at flows. We're also tracking flows. Where are the vehicles coming from? And so I looked at Central East Europe, West Central East Europe, what you see on the map there, and total sales 2018, 18.1 million. And you can see the major sourcing hubs, Japan, Korea, Middle East, Africa, North America. Going forward in 2028, at the horizon I'm showing you, there is actually quite an interesting shift. You can see China is actually increasing significantly in sourcing. And this is driven by the electrification of many brands and electrification strategies. Of course, also North America, certain vehicles which are localized there are not coming back anymore or are now coming from other locations. Tesla is the best example. 2019 still has Teslas coming from the US. And now it's either locally coming out of Germany or from China. Other vehicles, localization in China, the Smart brand, MG brand, Land Rover Discovery Electric. So pretty much everything what has a motor in it. Dacia Spring, the electric car of Dacia, where you need to build low-cost electric vehicles or electric vehicles at a good cost basis. This is what is fueling China as a sourcing ground in the future and takes volume, of course, from the other established sourcing locations away. Semiconductors, not gone, but less of an impact because the industry planned for the constraint. If you can see, so this is pretty much, we're doing a weekly tracking. Every Monday we're communicating to our customers. If you want our customer, you will see that. How many semiconductor vehicles or impacted vehicles got lost? So by OEM announcement, what did they plan, what didn't they build, and we're tracking that. And so last year, pretty much 10 million vehicles got built less, purely due to the supply chain shortage of semiconductors. where they tried to mitigate. Sometimes, of course, there's unfinished vehicles, so there are nuances to it, but in the end, 10 million units less last year just due to semiconductors. In first quarter last year, where things still looked good, we were at 1.5 million units, where we thought, okay, things are going to turn around. But then, as said, in second half, it really ramped up. As of today, or of yesterday, we're at 1.5 million units for Q1 and Q2 of this year. So there is less of an issue, less of a reported issue. The industry has actually found its path through. And as we see from the OEM announcements, they're all announcing less volume being sold because they're supply constrained, but they're all having and enjoying major profits and everybody's doing well. So they don't need to care really about if you're not a pure volume player, but if you have some kind of premium diversification, then you're actually living quite well with the reduced volumes at the moment and have you arranged yourself. So it's not gone, but it's slowing down. And this is pretty much full semiconductor, MCUs, so-called. We see end of next year, we could see an analog chip crisis coming, but I'm not going to go into that right now because that would take more time to discuss that. But so overall chip crisis, not over yet. It just shifts on what type of shifts we can see are available and in demand. So on the production side, slightly different picture as shown on the demand side. Pretty much every region besides mainland China is up. In mainland China, as said, we have to see what the constraint there due to the lockdowns will do further to production. If we have to take it further down, but we already took 2,500 out. You saw at the slide before, we're already factoring 500,000 of lost volumes just due to COVID lockdowns in China because the factories just can't operate. People are stuck in their homes in some of the major production areas. And yeah, we have to see how this develops and track that closely. Europe, because European conference. Europe, not too bad, recovery, strong recovery, 9.4% this year, anticipated, but again, still much below what it used to be in 2019. 2019, 19 million units, we're now reaching around about 15 million, 15.4 million units this year, and as said, it's purely supply constraint. There would be so much more demand, which could allow for more production, but there is just not more capacity in order to get this vehicle built, or, and this is another irony, chips that are available are put, of course, in the high-margin vehicles, which normally take more chips. So less vehicles are built with higher margins, so it's actually an artificial further reduction. So volume-wise, probably a couple more could be built, but it's not so profitable to do so. So this is what's going on there. On the production walk, Q1 was quite low, but as said, Q1 last year, everybody still thought things going to go well with the chip constraints. And then, as you can see, it went downhill. And we believe that in May, we will already have the cross point and then pass last year, which is the basis for the 9.4% growth. Electrification. So there's a lot of discussion about it. And it's a very emotional topic as well. So I will try to give you our spin on what's going on. And I'm only taking Europe now as an example. Europe passenger cars. So there is the Fit for 55 ambition of the European Commission, which says we want to be carbon neutral by 2050 in agreement with the Paris Climate Agreement. And by 2030, we want already have 55% of emission reductions versus 2021. And already 15% 2025. And so there is a big discussion what's going to happen in 2035, 2040, because if you really want to be carbon neutral by 2050, if you look at the theory and the park and everything needs to change, you pretty much have to stop selling combustion engine vehicles by 2035, the latest. Otherwise, you will not get the natural churn into your park because the lifespan of a vehicle is between 12 and 15 years, depending on what you buy. And so this is why there's a lot of discussion around the 2035 date right now. Is it 80% limit? Or is it already full ban of ICEs? So various associations, interest groups are, of course, lobbying and pushing back and forth right now. It's not clear yet. We're not working on a 2035 a ban assumption. because we believe, given the strategies the manufacturers are actually putting into place, you don't need to ban it anymore, because if everybody is executing so hard on the electrification strategy, and we get to that in a moment, it's a non-topic anymore. There's over-compliance reached in the short term anyways, and in the long run, because many don't have the money to do both. Go still full ICE or hybridization, plug-in hybrids, very expensive multi-energy platforms, and then running successful BEV programs on the side. That doesn't work. So many of them, and we will see it in a moment, will run pure BEV, and with that, you will get automatically to a very high penetration. There's, of course, the question, that percentage, on what basis is it? Is it on 18 million, 60 million, or will the European market then just be 10 million, because nobody can afford it anymore? But the percentages are more or less carved in stone, just due to the natural strategy many OEMs are running right now. We have some country individual approaches, of course. Norway is not part of the EU, so they can do what they want. They're pretty much 2025, they said, no more sales of ICEs, ZEV only. Netherlands wants to try it, but Netherlands is part of the EU and cannot forbid it. So you cannot just say, we're not selling, because if you have an homologation of a product in the EU, this is the beauty about the EU, you have to make it available in each country. You cannot, as an individual country, say, you cannot sell it anymore in this country. So what will they do? And the first signals coming up now, they will make it very, very uncomfortable for you to have an ICE by banning city areas, ZEV zones, high taxations, bonus malus systems, very aggressive ones, what we see already in, for example, in France. So you will very likely not buy an ICE anymore, or really just super niche because you have it, you want it, but everybody else needs to go electric, because otherwise it doesn't make any economic sense. UK, of course, not part anymore. There is a big discussion, 2030, 2035, what will be the ICE ban transition period? Is it just plug-ins? Is it mild hybrids? Is it full hybrids? So there's no ruling. Farage said he's gonna go against the electrification of the island with all he has. Let's see what happens there. If he can turn around the wheel and get the strict electrification trend shifted, what the current government is looking at. So we have to see. But there's also another interesting part. You see Euro 7. Euro 7 emission norms, everybody has Euro 6 right now. Euro 7 is planned for around about 2027. This will be, when we're talking to engineers at the OEMs, already so expensive to get the engines even cleaner, that the question is, will that be already the KO criteria anyways, on top of what I said, the cost of maintaining both at the same time? So can I still afford even to build a Euro 7 homologated engine, or do I need to share? Will then there be 2 or 3 engines out there which are homologated against EU 7 emission norms, and that's it, right? So for a niche application, and this is why we're selling. Is this actually giving even an earlier switch to BEVs? Because the question is also quite widely debated right now. What is really measured, right? And we know all these tricks and cheats about cold start function and when it can emit more or not, and the whole measurements. And there are some very extreme proposals out there, which pretty much will kill 60% of current engines easily out of the market if these would come through. There's only a few which could do it and actually have the money to afford it, to then still build ICE engine. And then the other question is, would there even be an Euro 8, or is it just Euro 7 continued? Was that the last engine emission norm we saw, and are we then switching to other norms? Secondary particulate emissions from your tires, from your brakes, and the legislator will find a lot of things to regulate still in your car. So don't worry, it's gonna... It stays interesting. They have a department, they need to find stuff. So that's pretty much the approach for Europe. That, of course, the very strict compliance environment also will create very common strategic approaches across the OEMs, and they will have a difficulty to differentiate. And we already see that with some of the vehicles coming over from China. Well executed, electric, good range, good software, the build quality, and it's also okay-ish, or sometimes even good. So the differentiation will actually be much more narrowed going forward, so you only have certain areas where you can differentiate yourself and pretty much put in a brand identity, right? Electrification, if the vehicle now accelerates from 4 seconds from 0 to 100 or 3.8 or 4.5 or even 5. Nobody in the end cares, right? It's going to be pretty fast. Everybody who has been in an electric vehicle knows there's a lot of punch. Then, of course, there's a range question. Maybe there comes in the sustainability question at some point, which will have a price impact. Where they're built, are there extra costs because it's not built in a carbon-free or friendly environment? But everybody pretty much is facing the same. The price increases, cost increases, raw materials, lithium, palladium, cobalt, nickel, everybody needs that for their batteries. Nobody has found the battery yet, which can be running without these input materials. SUV push, SUV nation, everybody said, oh, the SUV peak is over. People don't like SUVs anymore. It's not. SUV will be the standard vehicle shape probably in a couple of years from now. It's going to continue, but there's also good reason. People like it, but also it's actually quite handy to put the battery packs in. So for an electric vehicle, an SUV, the higher floor ground is actually, because the vehicle itself, if you look at, for example, a Tesla Model Y, it's not really high. It's not an off-road vehicle, but they call it SUV. The higher seating is because you can actually squeeze more battery in. Theoretically, right? And this is, if you look at all the others, EQA from Mercedes and so on, similar approach, right? EQC, best example, that tried to take it off-roading. It's as low as a street car, but the battery makes you sit higher, so you have the high drive comfort. So SUV is relative. Production synergies, of course, sharing of platforms, technologies is key. It's so expensive to do that shift for the industry. Business model shifts. Will I be just the provider of the hardware, the vehicle, or do I own then also the channel, how it's consumed? There are various things out there, various programs from various OEMs, which are pushing in the direction, not fully successful yet, but everybody is tipping a toe in the water to see, okay, what is the future business model? Because one thing which is very special to especially EVs is the duration of that vehicles. An electric motor, standard electric motor, and for example, the Ego startup, Professor Dr. Shu said it once, his motor from Bosch lasts 100 years without wear. The batteries, if you have smart battery engineering, you can take certain cells and replace them, and the batteries can go quite long. You can recycle it. So the vehicle itself actually can run much longer. So what is the new business model on that? Is it really the 3, 4, 5 years lease cycle and then into the second market? Or does the OEM own the vehicle for 6, 7, 8 years to try to get a return on investment, but also offer it at a lower price to begin with to make these higher costs available for entry segments? That's a very important piece. Software, of course, it's software. And this is really where you see two passes, right? China, pretty good in software. US, Silicon Valley, Tesla lives off the software. What we've seen so far here in Europe is okay-ish to bad, right? So there's still a lot of learning. Yeah, it will be a key. Because as I said, what is the differentiation of your EV? It's not the engine sound. Okay, it could be artificial, but it's not going to be so pricey. It is the software, the application. What can the vehicle do? How does it connect, interact with me? What can I steer with the software? How fast can I zoom? How good can I plan my route, my charging? So it is actually quite an important piece and a major shift of the value chain from traditional combustion engine manufacturing. Connectivity, ADAS, goes hand in hand with that. And then the complexity shift. It was super complex to build a diesel, common rate diesel, Euro 6 temp engine. This was, for example, what German engineering was all about, right? Super complex mechanical engineering. That's going to go away. So the complexity is now shifting into the electronics, into new system architectures, rethinking the car new from what it used to be as old manufacturing companies towards, tech companies in the end. And you have to do that with the resources and actually the setup you have, which is very difficult, as we can read in the news every day. So OEM reactions to these compliance pressures, to the strategies, everybody wants to go electric. So the last year was the year of electrification fireworks. Everybody announced new strategies. A lot of these, we have to be realistic, are also to please the stock market. It's not all carved in stone what I said, right? It's to please the stock markets, to please the investors, to say, okay, we're going to be 70% electrified. While this date is also to show you have a strategy, you kind of swimming together with the big ones, especially Tesla is chasing most of the companies in front of them. So we don't believe, and we're not taking for granted, every announcement there. But as I said, depending on the strategy and also the funding you have, some of them will have no other chance. And my best example, of course, is, for example, Ford in Europe. Ford is no longer going to build own vehicles on a combustion engine platform. Of course, you could get still a Ford Mustang or a pickup imported by a specialty importer over. But in the end, if you want to drive a Ford passenger car, we're talking only passenger car here, you will go electric after 2027. And after, in 2030, you will have 100% Ford EVs. Will Ford still sell 1 million units or 500,000? This is still TBD, and this is what I said. The percentage will be there, but then the question is, what about the volume? And you can see everybody is thriving in that direction with strong announcements. Some have the resources and the funding to do it, others not. And therefore, you have to really look at who you are at an OEM and what your footprint is. So for example, geographic footprint. Toyota, everybody said, oh, they were late to the party. But Toyota only has 55% of its global sales volumes in actually strict regulated markets, North America, Europe, China, and then they're doing a lot of good business in unregulated markets, over 45%. So they are not in a hurry because they're making good money in other parts of the world, and they can go much more niche into this than maybe a Volkswagen, who has 85% of their volume, Volkswagen car brand, in highly strictly regulated market. And there you understand the push with the ID platform, with the architectures which are to come. Then, of course, the technology strength, right? What is your old strength? What is your new? Can you do the shift to a software electrification provider? Financial situation. Do I have the funding to run so many programs in parallel? Or actually, do I have to partner up with somebody to take on a platform to share developments? Because it is very costly. And this is the development. We're not even talking about the battery supply chain and actually getting access to the high demand of batteries these days. This is purely what do we choose as an option. Because one thing which has also shown, a badly executed multi-energy platform, so where you can do plugins and battery electric vehicles on, doesn't do you any good, right? You have a very expensive, low range, maybe fancy looking vehicle nobody wants, right? So it's, you have to be very, very dedicated in regards to what you do there, and this costs a lot of money. And then, of course, the target customers, right? What is my traditional footprint? ID3, ID4, VW. You may say it's very conservative versus maybe some of the offerings we see from China or a Tesla or some of the other vehicles, but it's also, they have their different target customer audience. So what would be a Golf driver wanting as an electric vehicle? An electric Golf is not really possible due to the platform problems, but how would they look and feel comfortable in it? And so this is also very important. What is your target group, target audience, who you want to serve with your vehicles? And are you more conservative or more progressive and really trying something? And I see the clock is ticking, but I have time, Richard said. We see already one big impact, and this is pretty much by segment. A, B, C, D, E, F segment. A segment is a Smart, B is a Polo, C is a Golf, D is C-Class, E is E-Class, and S-Class, and F is special luxury. So besides the electrification push here, you can actually see that the A segment will actually decline massively, which is an irony. You're talking about congested city and moving with vehicles which are standing around in cities, taking parking space and so on. But exactly these vehicles, which would allow to have more vehicles in less space, will actually decline because it's nearly impossible to really successfully electrify them or at a good price point, and then also have the range. There will be a few ones left, lots of brands already pulled out, and this is why you see a steep decline there. The B segment is really the big one. The B segment is one next to the C segment, as you can see, with over 4 million units, is the core segment in Europe. And the question there is, will it be possible to get the costs down and the specifications up of these vehicles that you can substitute what you're building today? And my best example is, currently there's 500,000 Fiat Pandas being built. 11,000, 11,500 entry list price. Will Fiat be able to, for 11 or 15,000, to sell 500,000 electric Pandas with a range of 100, 110, 120 kilometers? Probably not. So the question is, what do you do? Will you go bigger? Or will the battery technology advance so much in the next couple of years that you could get to 250, 300 kilometers? Questionable. There will be a lot happening on the battery side, but this is really a tough one to crack. So this is the one which is where we have the most question mark because of the cost pressure and the availability and position in the market. Because if you want to have a long range, Clio, Fiat Panda, whatever in that segment, it will cost you at the moment 23,000, 24,000. And then if the subsidies go away, and let's say the price come down, you're still at 18,000. 11,000 versus 18,000 is quite a gap to bridge. And there we come to these ownership models, which now more and more OEMs looking at. Can we actually provide mobility as subscription, right? The Netflix of driving. In summer you take your bike. In the winter you take a car. You just rent one. 6 months short-term lease at good cost, right? Without owning it. And is there a solid business case behind it? And this is still to be proved. Otherwise, there will be also a social component to it, when it means that pretty much you can only afford cars or sell cars C segment onwards, and B and A segment is for high income people who can afford having a pricey small car, but for the broad mass, pretty much they will be taken out of new vehicle mobility and have to live with used cars. So that's quite an interesting thing and a worry to look at how this will develop, and there's still a lot of question marks. Therefore, the forecast is relatively conservative still, but we have to see, will it go up, down? This is where I would put my biggest question mark in this forecast. And last, this is what we're forecasting, and this is why I said, it's very controversial. EU 30 passenger cars, you saw Fit for 55 would pretty much see 55% of BEV vehicles, but we believe the topic of pure ICE will be gone by 2027. Then we will have mild hybrid, which is pretty much 48-volt systems going through. But then, in the end, we will have to reach a 70% electrification share by 2030, not driven by regulation, driven by what's available. And then we can discuss, will it be 14, 12, 16, 18 million units? That is then the question. But if you all add it up, and the committed changes, we're coming to this result. So it's no longer a compliance discussion, it's a product and strategy topic. And that was it.
Thank you, Henner. What a fantastic and insightful presentation. A lot to impact there. So we still have a little bit of time for this session, so I'm going to open it out to the audience if you do have any questions to pick Henner's brain. So, yeah, question at the front here. The young man with the microphone can assist, please.
Thank you very much, Greg Ombach, Airbus. Thanks, Henner, for fantastic presentation, and it was really great to see how you are predicting the future based on your past experience as well. The question which I have is, you know, if I would be here in this room something like about 3 years ago, before the COVID, in these main trends which you presented, we will also talk a lot about the sharing economy and about car sharing and how this is going to impact the entire supply chain. Now, we haven't talked today anything about the sharing economy, and my question is going: how you are predicting after, because of the experience with the last pandemic, how your experience the sharing economy is going to, how it's going to come back, and what is going to be impact on these numbers we have seen? Thank you.
It's sharing economy is one of the business models they're looking at, but you're completely right. It doesn't work. It didn't work before. The pandemic even put a full stop to it. We saw lots of consolidation. The problem with sharing is, and this is an American phrase from my colleagues, sharing is not caring. The damage, we saw it in China, how dirty it is, right? People eating in the car, sleeping in the cars, blip car in France, the homeless people always slept in them and so on, right? It's really, it's a very tricky segment. So there is sharing, of course. We believe the programs will exist, but this is not the game changer. The game changer will be subscription models. Phone-driven subscription model, and we see a couple of those already. You book a vehicle, you order a vehicle, 6 months subscription from October to February, and therefore you get drive from A to B in a city or outside the city. In summer you take the bike or the train or whatever, which is more convenient to do. We believe this is the area which is more successful versus common, everybody can share. Because then the question also, if this really takes up, and this is the same about the autonomous pod standing everywhere and driving you from A to B without a driver, where are those vehicles parking? City space is limited. Of course, in certain markets, you have the possibility to build space for it, build space around it. You can build infrastructure from scratch, especially in emerging economies. But here in very mature economies, take downtown London. Where would you put another fleet of 10,000 autonomous pods? Where would they stay, right? Because they can't circle, because they have to be electric, right? So it's the sharing itself, we believe, remains niche. The subscription model is what to look at. And then you can get the life cycle out of the vehicle, because you take it 6 months, you have a little bit of damage fee maybe, but it's hands off, you don't have to worry about insurance, super convenient, right? You book it with your app. It's already possible today. Give it back, and then next winter you get a new one. Or a one which is slightly used or refurbished. Toyota, for example, is building up refurbishing capacities now in the UK to really refurbish factory-wise the vehicles to make them look as new. And so we believe this is the extension of the life cycle, because the electric motor, as said, is not the problem, it's the surrounding piece.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's some more questions at the back there. And obviously, shared mobility is going to have a real big impact on vehicle logistics as well, something we'll cover in this conference as well. But there's a question at the back, please.
This is Marcus Ramirez with FedEx. I have a question related to hydrogen or fuel cell technology. We see that in the commercial segment, there's a lot of discussion with fuel cells because of apparent long-haul range reasons. Did you find any evidence that we'll see a similar development in light vehicles?
It's the question we're getting a lot, right? Our forecast, if you saw it, is not really showing an aggressive passenger vehicle fuel cell adoption. It is very expensive, it's not very efficient, and we believe battery technology will be so advanced in 5-6 years from now that actually the fuel cell doesn't make much sense also from a commercial point of view. There will be niche applications, and we know, for example, Japanese OEMs doing it, Hyundai is doing it, but they're doing it for specific reasons and not because they're making money with it, right? So it's more an experimental setup than this is really the future of affordable mobility. If you look at some of the fuel cell vehicles you have on the road today, real price would be way beyond 100,000 euros. And I think 70,000 is the entry price, and you can only lease them. So in the passenger side, we don't believe fuel cell. One topic which always comes up is the topic of e-fuels. So this is something to watch, what's happening with the remaining fleet, because we need it for aviation, we need it for ship transport, we need it for long-haul transport where battery doesn't make much sense, or for example, construction. Right, you will not have a construction vehicle which can carry a lot of turf, not sure what the term is, where you put all the dirt in, when you dig a hole.
A good old dumper truck.
A dumper truck, exactly. It's a dumper truck. You're not going to have that with a fuel cell. It's way too expensive to maintain. So how do you get those vehicles clean, right? What is the distance? Do they go short term, just within a certain facility, or do they really have to go miles and miles with tons of load every day back and forth? So fuel cell, we believe, is coming in commercial applications, yes, but in the passenger, for now, we're not convinced this will have a big impact, because you will have the battery technology advance quite significantly in the next 5 to 7 years, which don't make it necessary to go down that route. Because again, it's also infrastructure cost. Hydrogen is not an easy thing to have in your basement. We can't forget about that. It's a very sensitive material, right? You need to have very high pressure tanks, so it's for us in passenger applications niche, if at all.
Great question, thank you. And perhaps one from my side on electrification. You've showcased the roadmaps of many of the OEMs, a lot of the announcements last year. On the flip side of that, on the supply side, how do you foresee that market? Do the two tie up? Is there a balance there in terms of the ability to supply what we're perceiving the demand to be?
Not really. And this is also another question mark. Also now with, of course, some of the supply limits, which we see of special materials depending on Russian sourcing. At the moment, if you look 27, 28, the business case cannot work because there's not so much supply. However, it's not impossible to ramp up the supply. So the material is there. but to ramp up a lithium mining operation is, I think, between 2 and 4 years, depending where you are. So there is still enough time, and if an investment now comes, it's the same with charging. Today, charging is not enough, but charging has to come and will accelerate if there's enough focus on it to enable it. So we're not taking that as restrictors, but we're, of course, pointing it out as a risk. And of course, for the suppliers themselves, they got shocked, right? Especially if you're a big engine parts supplier, your business model within 2 or 3 months got shot apart. Suddenly, you may have looked at last all the way to early 2030s, and with these very aggressive announcements, you have to really reposition yourselves much more aggressively than maybe 6 months before, while you were enjoying COVID pandemic in mid-2020, because it came very, very abrupt, the announcement from many OEMs to really execute now hard on these electrification strategies.
Fantastic. Well, that brings us to a close for this session. So I want to thank Henner for his time and his insights. And I should say that there will be a version of the presentation available for the wider audience. So, but do make the most of Henner being with us here today. Pick his brains throughout the rest of the conference as well. So thank you again to Henner for his insights.